This is Mr. Hulsey of H Squared Sufficiently Understood Science, and today we're going to be looking at the three types of adaptations. So the three types of adaptations are behavioral, physiological, and structural. Structural is oftentimes referred to as physical adaptations, but for the purposes of this video, we're going to use structural. Just know that it's the same thing. So behavioral, and we'll go over each one of these in turn, is an action that aids survival, some kind of behavior. Physiological are the jobs of the body parts, specifically those controlling life processes. So you can kind of think of physiological as the inside. And then you have structural, which is a body part or coloring that aids in survival. So typically these are going to be on the outside of the body. So behavioral adaptations, include activities that help an animal to survive. Hunting activities, defensive activities, they can be learned or they can be instinctive, but they are physical actions by the organism. And so, for example, the possum hanging upside down from the tree, or playing possum whenever it is threatened, is a behavioral activity. It's a action. So a great example of this is humans, behavior for protection. There's a reason we live in family groups. We live in family groups so that we can protect one another. And so that is a behavioral adaptation, whereas some organisms live individually. And so as humans, we actually have different social behaviors and behaviors that we do for protection. A physiological adaptation are changes within the cell or tissue of an organism in response to an environmental stimulus. So these are internal changes that help maintain homeostasis, like cows or zebras having multiple stomachs in order to process the grasses that they eat. Another example would be snakes with venom. So the teeth themselves are a structural adaptation, not physiological. But what makes this a physiological adaptation is the venom gland. And so how this works is that there is a gland right in here in the snake's face or head or skull, and it has a compressor muscle. Now, when a snake strikes, venom is pushed through the glands and out the fangs, and they can have pretty devastating effects, such as what you're seeing in the video right now. A single drop of this venom is able to completely coagulate that blood, and it helps them to survive. So they're using an internal adaptation to help them with survival. Now, structural adaptations are some part of an animal's body. Teeth, body coverings, movement, how their legs are developed and how they move, much like a shark's teeth. Okay, those are a structural adaptation. They're designed for destroying animals, pretty much eating and ripping and tearing, and they have multiple rows of these wonderful, terrifying things. And teeth are one of the great examples. So teeth, since different animals eat different things, they don't all have the same kind of teeth. One of the things that me and my little kids like to do is when we go to, they're still very little, and so we go to the museum, and we'll go through the dinosaur section, and they'll be looking at the different dinosaurs and looking at their teeth and saying that one, and looking at and saying that one ate meat because its teeth are sharp. That one ate plants because its teeth are flat. And so we can see these different structural adaptations that are necessary to gather the food that they need. Then you have body coverings like hair, scales, spines, and feathers that grow from the skin. All these parts help the animal to survive in their environments. Hair keeps warmth, feathers also keep warmth, and things like that. And then you have movement. Animals find food by moving from place to place. And so they use their movement, and how their body is structured in order to find food. Kind of going back to that idea of natural selection, we talked about how natural selection is determined by the needs of the environment. So an example here, talking about body coverings, is camouflage. This is the animal's ability to hide itself from predators or prey. And going back to natural selection, this is going to increase the chances of survival and reproduction. Those are our two big things. If you haven't seen that video, make sure you watch the natural selection video as well. That will help explain a few things from this tutorial. So they're different based on the environment, physiology and behavior, and type of predator or prey they are evading. So camouflage really is nearly individual, but we have some basic categories that we can talk about. So probably the most known is going to be the background matching, where the animal matches the background of the environment that it's in. But then you also have disruptive colorization and motion dazzle. This is typically going to be stripes. So how this works is the zebras here, because they're all striped and they herd up together, so they use that behavioral adaptation as well. It's really difficult to tell how many of them there are, and a large predator is not going to attack those zebra just head on because they don't necessarily know exactly where one begins and the other one ends. And so they typically wait for these animals to get on their own before they attack. And so that's one way that they use their camouflage. Then you have counter shading. This one's very common for organisms that either, like birds, use counter shading quite often, but mostly fish. And so this is really easy to see. I'm just going to draw a line through this fish really quick. And so if you were above the water and you were looking down, you would see the dark part of the fish. Well, that blends in really well when you're looking down in water where it's dark. If you were below the fish and looking up towards the surface, this white area right here is going to blend in more with sunlight. And so they use this counter shading in order to avoid predatory animals. And then everyone's favorite color change, where the animal uses chromatophores in its skin to change its color. Now, where I live here in Texas, we have these little animals that can do this, and it's actually pretty cool. They turn from brown to green, and sometimes a little bit orangish. Now, mimicry is a really cool form of camouflage. It's a superficial resemblance of two or more organisms that are not closely related. Typically, the main means of protection against enemies for these organisms is the fact that they look like another. For example, right here, these two butterflies. So we have one that's poisonous, one that is not, and I'm sure you could see by the bottom of the screen which one's which. But if this were covered up and you couldn't see, and I'm going to just be like this, I'm just going to cover this up. And if you didn't know which one was which, it'd be really difficult to tell, especially if you were a predator flying around and these are moving And so this is a really great way of protecting themselves, because if a bird eats a monarch butterfly, then it gets sick and it's going to avoid those. Now, there are different types of mimicry. There are different types of mimicry that occur. And so we have Batesian mimicry, which is like the hoverfly and the honeybee. This is where it closely resembles a harmful species, but is not dangerous in itself. And you can see the hoverfly is the mimic here. The honeybee can sting, whereas the hoverfly cannot. And so the hoverfly is using that black and white coloration to look like a honeybee to keep things away from it. Then you have Mullerian mimicry, where two or more poisonous or unpalatable species resemble each other and are both avoided. And so both of these use that yellow and black color scheme. They're both dangerous. They both can sting. One, the yellow jacket is a little bit more ferocious, and so it will, just by association, people will avoid it, as well as animals. And then we have my favorite, absolute favorite type of mimicry, and that's going to be self-mimicry. And this is where one body part, you have one body part that mimics another to increase survival during an attack. You see this not only on insects, but like fish, where they have dots on their tail that almost resemble eyes. And so an organism like a shark might attack the tail, and the main part of the fish can get away. And so they can live another day. But right here, we see what looks and appears to be owl eyes. But in fact, this is a moth. So let's take a look at a really great example of the utilization of camouflage. So right here we have this little caterpillar, right? And it blends in very well with the leaf. Here we have an example of self-mimicry, and no, this is not a snake. A snake, it is not. In fact, it's that same caterpillar we just saw. This is its cocoon, but it's using self-mimicry in order to protect itself. In fact, this thing moves around. The caterpillar, as it's going through its stages, turning into what it will become, is going to move around, and it actually causes the snakes, I'm going to put quotation marks because you can't see me doing it, the snake's head to move. And so organisms are going to avoid it. Rather than eating the cocoon, organisms will avoid it. And then we have this moth that we saw earlier. Fun fact, all three of those are the same thing. This is its final stage. And so once again, it's using self-mimicry, but also, in a way, it's also using Batesian mimicry. It's using camouflage to blend in. And so this is actually a really amazing little organism that really takes advantage of that mimicry. And animals aren't the only thing that can use mimicry. This pile of rocks you see here is actually, some of them are plants. So these guys right here are actually succulent plants. And they're blending in as rocks. There's some more of them. There's another one over here. And so mimicry is not just the animal kingdom. It can be, mimicry and camouflage is not just the animal kingdom, but it also in the plant kingdom. So I hope you've enjoyed our tutorial on adaptations in organisms. Please join us next time for our next tutorial. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and comment down below. Hit that bell notification because YouTube doesn't really know how to work. All right, see you next time.